the way I put it in my book was, instead of the theurgists taking on the shape of the gods, which is what happens in theurgy, in the magical tradition, the gods take the shape of the magician. The magician, in a sense, is sort of more of an egocentric, sort of has an egocentric agenda, where as a particular individual, he or she wants to dominate the whole, wants to dominate the world they're in. Whereas in theurgy, the individual tries to become transparent to the divine mind that permeates the world so that it can express itself through that individual, who then becomes a kind of a face of the all instead of dominating over the all. It's not, there's no dominance in theurgy, where you do see a kind of dominance played out in magical circles.
So I'm interested to hear when you first encountered this figure, Iamblichus.
Well, I think the very first time I ever read his name was reading Madame Blavatsky's Isis Unveiled. But it didn't mean anything to me. She just listed him as one of the Platonists who kept alive what she called the ancient wisdom. And that was it. And it didn't really sink in any way that got traction with me until years later, specifically when I was in graduate school at UC Santa Barbara in religious studies. That's when it really began to, Iamblichus really began to speak to me and connect with me. It was came out of a class that I had on religions in the Roman Empire. And do you want me to explain that, how that unfolded for me, or because I'd be happy to?
Yeah, sure, because I think even in religious studies, you don't always run into, people like Iamblichus. So yeah,
Okay,
it's maybe
sure.
a unique
Well,
story.
my professor was a really engaging and stimulating guy, and he invited me to read Iamblichus's On the Mysteries, which is where he talks about theurgy. And he also invited me to read E.R. Dods' Critique of Theurgy at the end of The Greeks and the Irrational, a very famous article that Dodds had written, I think, in the late 40s. Dodds is a fascinating person in many regards, but he was very, very critical of theurgy, and he thought that what Iamblichus was doing, I think he characterized it as superstitious dribblings, and misguided, and taking Platonism down the path of superstition and irrationality. And the idea that you could be possessed by the gods, or that something could come in that was greater or more than your rational awareness, was just unacceptable to Dodds. And he thought it was very unplatonic. So he was full of criticism for Iamblichus and On the Mysteries and Theurgy. But I read on the Mysteries, and when I read it, I realized that Iamblichus was describing experiences that I had had myself, mostly through performing chanting and ritual actions. I'd experienced things that he described exactly in his treatise on the mysteries. I thought, my God, this guy really gets it. I didn't know anybody, especially in the Western tradition, was able to describe things that I had experienced myself using Eastern techniques. I was involved in yoga, and particularly I was doing Tibetan chants, and he was capable of describing exactly what happened when I did those practices. And so I thought, I don't think Dodds gets it. I don't think Dodds experienced for himself, so that he could see that what Iamblichus was describing and On the Mysteries was a very accurate and insightful reading on a psychological level of what was going on in these rituals. So I wrote a paper criticizing E.R. Dods for my professor, and that kind of got the ball rolling. So that's really was my introduction to Iamblichus.
Hmm. So E.R. Dodds, I'm guessing that he was a Christian theologian of some kind.
E.R. Dodds, I wouldn't call him a Christian theologian. He was a classicist, rationalist, Victorian rationalist, very fascinating person, well worth reading, brilliant. And by classicist, I mean he was an expert in Greek. And if it wasn't for E.R. Dodds, we wouldn't know about Neoplatonism in the English speaking world today. He translated Proclus's Elements of Theology, which was Proclus's kind of description of how the one unfolds into the many and into this world, and almost a perfect sort of like a Bach fugue, just unfolding geometrically from the one down into our world. And Dodds translated it, had incredibly good notes to go along with it, and commentary. So he was fascinated with the Platonists. I would not necessarily call him a Christian. Um, Nothing I've really seen about Dodds's life where he espouses a connection with Christianity. It was mostly he was a classicist and a rationalist, and he happened to indulge himself in the reading of the Neoplatonists, which to other classicists seemed like an indulgence. That's why I used the word. I think Gilbert Murray, who was Dodds's companion at Oxford, referred to Dodds's work on the Neoplatonists as his own sideshow.
Hmm.
But because they didn't think much of Neoplatonism.
Yeah,
You know.
well, I guess I associate that kind of condescension with the kind of Christian attitude toward any kind of magical practice or polytheism.
Well, the interesting thing is that the condescension is as strong towards uh, Christianity, particularly towards Catholicism, which is seen as a kind of an embarrassment to the rationalists, because Catholics believe that something magical happens in the Mass,
Mhm.
and that's just not rational. And so it's the condescension, I think, is much more from the rationalist perspective than even the Christian one. The Christians, in a way, even back to Augustine, recognized that this world that Iamblichus was talking about was real, and that he believed that there were spirits and daimons. He just thought they were bad.
Right.
Uh,
Yeah.
um, and so the condescension is more like, oh, it's just nothing but bullshit. It's superstition. That's more of a contemporary rational sort of critique. And
Yeah.
Dodds is a reflection of that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I guess I should have specified, kind of assuming that we were talking about Protestants, maybe is V.R. Dodds from England?
Yeah, he's
Yeah.
he's English. Actually he's Irish,
Hmm.
um, and but as far as I know, he had no connection with the church. Um, he hung out with uh, William Butler Yeats, the great
A
poet
mystic.
and the mystic,
Hmm.
and he was a member of the Society for Psychical Research as well.
Okay.
E.R. Dodds
So he
was,
was
and in fact,
open-minded.
he was very open-minded, except he tended to be a materialist.
Hmm.
So that's where it was closed down. He didn't want to be suckered into believing in what was very popular in his day, spiritualist circles, where somebody would be possessed by a departed spirit and then say things. And Dodds didn't believe that. And so he wanted to sort of disabuse his contemporaries of that kind of superstitious thinking. And I think in some ways, his critique of Iamblichus was sort of also a critique of his spiritualists of his own day.
Hmm. Hmm.
Yeah.
Okay. And so who was Iamblichus? When did he live? What was the scene that he was
Yeah.
moving
Iamblichus
in?
was a descendant of a kind of prestigious Syrian family of priests and kings. Um, He came from, I think, a pretty well-endowed family financially because he had villas and he lived in Syria in Apamea. Um, he's we What we know about his early life is kind of speculation, but he was introduced to the Platonic tradition. He studied Pythagoreanism in detail. You could say more that he was a Pythagorean as much as he was a Platonist. Um, he supposedly studied with Porphyry for a while, who was the person who wrote that letter to Anibo that stimulated or resulted in the On the Mysteries, which is a response to that letter. Um, so he was introduced to Platonism and Pythagoreanism, uh, very immersed in it. He studied with a mathematician named Anatolius as well. He went back to Syria, Apamea, and he opened up his own Platonic school there. What does that mean, Platonic school? It was just some guy who knows Platonism, and he invited people to study with him. And so we would call it a school. I don't know what they would call it, but he was attracting students. And he also believed in, I don't know if believed in is the right way to describe it. He also was impressed by, believed in the power of Chaldean oracles, these recipes that were received by priests in Apamea, in a temple there, that were recitations or formulas for uniting with the gods. And Iamblichus believed that these were legitimate and powerful and real, and he saw them as practicing theurgy. Um, so he was an interesting kind of Platonist who immersed himself in these Chaldean uh, oracles and explained them. In fact, he wrote several books interpreting them, but they didn't survive. But he was a Platonist who was influenced by Chaldean ritual magic, you could say. He wouldn't have called it magic because that takes on a certain connotation for him that
Yeah.
wasn't positive.
And so the Chaldean gods, are we talking about the planets? Like the seven Chaldean planets?
That's a good question, and I would say my I'm not an expert in the Chaldean planets, but I think that the primary source for the Chaldean ritual is the sun, and it was a very much of a solar kind of practice where they united with the sun. But yes, the planets were also seen as deities, gods. But they were also associated with the Platonic planetary gods. So Iamblichus united the revelations of the Chaldeans with the information from Plato in the Timaeus and other writings. So he kind of fused together this kind of Chaldean ritual tradition with Platonic philosophy. And that's kind of what defines his own unique form of Platonic theurgy.
Hmm. I'm not sure if you mentioned it, but I believe Iamblichus lived in the 4th century AD.
Yeah, he was born in 242, died in around 325. Probably wrote his book on the mysteries in around 305 or so. So that's early fourth century, yes.
Mhm.
And it was before Christianity had become the religion of the empire, before it became an imperial religion. It was still just growing. So it wasn't a real threat yet. It didn't become a threat to theurgists until later in the fourth and then in the fifth century, where it became literally illegal to even practice theurgy.
Mhm. So, in On the Mysteries, what kind of rituals and experiences is he describing there that corresponded so much with what you were experiencing through your yogic practices?
Okay, that's a good question. And um, the the experience that I had, which was before I read Iamblichus, was when I was doing chanting of certain mantras, Tibetan mantras. The experience I had was that I wasn't chanting them anymore. The experience I felt was that they were being chanted through me.
Mhm.
that they had a kind of power in and of themselves, that I was just entering into their current, you could say, riding that energy. And it was clearly that I wasn't the agent, the mantra was the agent, and I was the recipient. When I read what Iamblichus said about the names of the gods and these secret uh, asema anomata, which means meaningless sounds that the theurgists would chant, um, he said they have a power in and of themselves,
Mhm.
and that when you chant them, um, in effect, they do the work and they recognize themselves through the chanting itself. You don't direct it. It's not a product of your own thinking. In fact, our thinking has some value, but it not in terms of making those connections.
Yeah.
So
Well, I
yeah,
mean, I have a background in yoga as well, and I've done a lot of chanting and studied Sanskrit. But what he's talking about is what we call bija mantras, these
bija mantras, yes,
untranslatable syllables.
yes,
Yeah, that contain a kind of energy or power that when you chant them, it unlocks that power. But it's not
and
like this means that.
no, it's not a matter of a meaning thing. And Porphyry said, well, what do these things mean? And Iamblichus would say, it's not about what they mean. It's not a matter of how we think them. We have to do them.
Yeah,
We
it's
have to
about what
perform
they
them.
do, not what they mean. Yeah, what they
Exactly.
affect. Yeah.
Um, I emphasize that a great deal in this last book I recently published called Hellenic Tantra, where I try to help us understand what theurgy is or was for Iamblichus by comparing it to South Asian Tantra. And by using the models that you just referred to, the Bija mantras, for example, it's a much better way of understanding what Iamblichus meant by the asema anomata, which means the meaningless sounds. He said, they may be meaningless to us, but they're not meaningless to the gods. They're full of meaning in the God world, but not in our conceptual world.
Hmm.
So it's exactly that. And that's why I wanted to use Tantra as a way to invite people to understand what Iamblichus was doing.
Right. And I mean, that works because Tantra has, well, it continues to be practiced. So we
Yes,
have something to refer to, whereas the Greek mysteries have been all but lost to us. Like we don't have transcriptions of these mantras necessarily or how to chant them, you know.
exactly. Tantra is still a living tradition, and Iamblichine theurgy is not a living tradition. I mean, there's evidence of it in texts, and they're pretty good texts to look at. But a text is different from having a tantric master, say, like a Muktananda or somebody else who is a kind of a siddha, you know, a man or woman with supernatural or supernormal powers. And we don't believe that anybody can have supernormal powers because we're materialists in the West.
Mhm.
But in the circles of Iamblichus, they did. And again, it's similar to what goes on in the yoga traditions. Um,
Mhm.
you know, there were reports of levitation, telepathy. Um, Even Socrates had supernormal powers.
Mhm. So
But
siddhis.
cities, exactly. Yeah,
And even if the practitioner doesn't have all of these siddhis themselves or claim to, they may be part of an unbroken tradition. So these mantras, the practices, rituals being passed down orally for generations.
right, exactly. And um, that's that was the great value of Tantra for me, is why I wanted to make that comparison. In fact, the title of the book, Hellenic Tantra, was actually suggested to me as a kind of an insult from somebody who wrote to me and said,
Mm,
what you're doing with the Iamblichus is nothing but Hellenic Tantra. And he meant
yeah,
it in a disparaging way. And I thought, right on, dude. You know, that's exactly what it is. I thought it
yeah,
was very, I was glad he characterized it though. I like the ring of it. It is Hellenic
right.
Tantra.
Because it could help people get a better sense of what they were doing. But
Yeah.
yeah, that I mean that also reminds me of that kind of Brahmanical condescension toward the Hatha yogis. You know, like even when Vivekananda came over to
Yeah,
Chicago and did his big introduction to the West of this
yeah,
tradition, he would talk about like those dirty Hatha yogis, where he was much more interested in Raja yoga, you know, this
I know,
royal
yes.
path.
Except his teacher, Ramakrishna, was a messy tantric
He was
dude.
wild. I mean, he was a
Yeah,
Kali worshiper or channel even for Kali.
absolutely. He wasn't anything like what Vivekananda was promoting.
Yeah. Well, yeah. Well, that's really interesting. And I was wondering actually why you chose Tantra really, because like Tantra is so misunderstood here in the West as well. So in a way, you have to kind of like explain uh, Tantra to the people before you say, and then this theurgy was a lot like Tantra. But like, let's first dispel some of the confusion around what Tantra is. So maybe
Yeah,
get into
yeah.
that a little bit, would you?
Well, I tried to do that in this book. I don't claim to be an expert on tantra. That requires incredible amount of study and knowledge of Sanskrit and
And
a
there's
lot
no
of
one
things.
can be an expert on it. I mean, it's too broad and vast and complicated.
But I
But
read the experts as well as I could, as much as I
yeah.
could, and I try to dispel the notion that tantra is nothing but a kind of glorification of our sexuality or something like that. It doesn't disparage our sexuality, but it's more of the emphasis I wanted to make was that it's an embodied form of spiritual path. It's a spirituality that embraces the body completely, and so did theurgy. And it's in that regard that I think that it's useful for us. Um, and I think that Tantra is not a dualist kind of spirituality. It's not trying to escape your body or escape the world, but bring divine experience into your body and into the world. So that it's different from, let's say, Samkhya yoga, where you're trying to get away from all of the material world, the prakriti, and say no to everything. And Tantra says yes to everything, but in the right way. So I try to characterize Tantra as being worldly affirming as a way, as a path towards becoming enlightened. And that's what theurgy was. And the parallel I found between the tantric um, push against the, say, Shankara's kind of yoga, which was sort of an austere, internalized, getting away from the physical, um, was similar to what I think Iamblichus was doing with respect to the previous expression of his tradition seen in Plotinus and promoted by Porphyry, which was more of an interiorizing uh, um, discipline. And Iamblichus thought, no, you have to, the only way you can reach the divine is by going into the world and engaging material things, including materially stimulated emotions as well, is very much trying to work with the world that we're in instead of getting away from it. It's not an escape, it's a transformation.
Hmm. Yeah, because some of those other early Greek traditions were about ascending through the chain of being, the soul returning to the nous, to the one.
Yes,
So very much like some of the yogic traditions, which are ascensionist, let's say.
ascensionists, exactly.
Mhm.
Yeah, and there's a writer named Georg Forstein who writes about
Oh
the
yeah, he was
ascensional.
Canadian.
Oh, is he? Yeah,
Yeah, he
he's a
was.
very
Yeah.
good, he's a good writer, and he talks about the ascensional tradition,
Hmm.
which Tantra is not. It's bringing it down,
Hmm.
and you know, there's a part of me that became suspicious because I practiced yoga for several years myself before I discovered Iamblichus. Um, Reflecting on my own experience of being an ascensional yogi, um, living in a very austere kind of life, I realized on reflection that it had a lot of value for me. I'm not going to say that it was not worth doing, but it was limited. it was um, it was to some degree escapist. and it felt less connected to other people and to the world.
Hmm.
And I I thought that that wasn't the best path for me. And maybe it is for some people, but it wasn't for me. And I thought that Iamblichus exemplified how to embrace the body and embrace the world. And that was useful for me too, personally.
Hmm. Yeah, I mean, what I kind of came to in terms of the, uh, the upholding of non-attachment, disidentification with the body, with the material realm, that being maybe an important step in terms of not being completely identified
Yep,
with the
exactly.
personality, with the body. So having that initial break, but then re-entering the world with that kind of perspective or attitude.
Yeah,
So it can kind of lighten your experience a bit, but so that you're not so caught up in suffering and dukkha and all dramas of life.
exactly. It's a funny thing, learning how to withdraw, but not withdraw completely.
Mhm. Or
Let
forever,
or
or aspire
forever.
to that.
Right,
Yeah.
right,
Hmm.
right. And that ultimately learning how to be gentle with our own attachments and not condemn the fact that we're attached or that we're angry or, just let it be. I think the Stoics actually had a good handle on some of that stuff. I think it was Marcus Aurelius said, it's not a problem to be angry. That's just a natural reaction. The problem is when you start to, uh, you know, uh, justify it or think about it and build up a world around it. Just let it flow through you. You know,
Hmm.
it's just like being in the world. The wind blows by.
Yeah.
Let it go.
Yeah. Well, great philosopher John Lydon, Johnny Rotten, said anger is an energy. And he repeats
Yeah.
that in a song like a mantra, and well, he screams it, but it's pretty great.
Oh, is
Just
that
remember
Did
it.
you say Johnny Rotten?
Yeah,
Oh,
yeah,
okay. I know who he is. Yeah, sure, of
from
course.
Public Image Limited. But
Yeah, right, right, right.
yeah,
Yeah,
and
yeah. There's an insight there. Yeah,
yeah, it's an
yeah,
energy, and what does energy want to do? It wants to move. It wants to move through.
yeah. Right,
Yeah.
right.
Um, okay. Uh, Another thing that I found interesting, because when I hear people talk about Neoplatonism, and how it kind of reemerges in the Renaissance with people like Marsilio Ficino, it's often associated with magic.
Hmm.
And in the book, you say that Iamblichus drew a distinction between what he was doing with theurgy and what other people might be doing with magic or sorcery.
Right. Yeah. It seems like magic. Theurgy seems like magic, and in fact, when theurgy was, I guess you could say, wiped out or repressed by the institutional church, the academy was closed in the early sixth century. Um, it went underground, and it was preserved by well, in a hidden way in certain Christian circles, and then it filtered into certain Muslim circles. But it also filtered into what we might call the magical tradition, where people uh, would invoke planetary powers or spirits of different parts of the natural world, just the same way that theurgists would. And so some of the practices of theurgy were preserved in the magical tradition, I think.
Mhm.
The distinction that Iamblichus wants to make and does make very clearly is that he condemns magicians, I mean, the goetes, sorcerers, it might be a way of describing it, because of the intentions of what they do compared to what theurgists do. And it basically boils down to this. When a person performs theurgy, he or she uh, becomes receptive, in a sense, empty or passive, so as to be able to receive the energies of the gods that flow through them. And if they do that, Iamblichus says, through the theurgical ritual, they take on the shape of the gods. Okay? So the theurgist takes on the shape of the gods by becoming empty. You don't see a lot of that kind of practice evidenced in the magical papyri or literature of magicians. They usually include spells that a magician is supposed to perform in order to acquire power, power beyond human capacity. And it's not so much about being receptive as it is about acquiring power. Maybe there is within the magical tradition techniques for how to receive this power that are very much like what theurgists do, but it seems as if the emphasis is on, well, the way I put it in my book was instead of um, the theurgists taking on the shape of the gods, which is what happens in theurgy, in the magical tradition, the gods take the shape of the magician. The magician, in a sense, is sort of more of an egocentric, sort of has an egocentric agenda, where as a particular individual, he or she wants to dominate the whole, wants to dominate the world they're in. Whereas in theurgy, the individual tries to become transparent to the divine mind that permeates the world so that it can express itself through that individual, who then becomes a kind of a face of the all
Mm.
instead of dominating over the all. It's
Mm.
not, there's no dominance in theurgy, where you do see a kind of dominance played out in magical circles.
Hey, I want to take a moment to speak with you about this channel. Currently, only 11% of viewers are subscribed to the channel. I think those numbers are terrible. So if you're enjoying this content and you want to help out the channel, please take a moment right now to like this video and subscribe. And if you really want to help out the channel, you can become a member of the Howl in the Wilderness Patreon, which will give you access to early release of full ad-free episodes, plus access to the archive of the first 100 episodes of this podcast. It would really help me out and allow me to keep creating content like the interview that you're watching right now. Okay, thanks so much. Now, back to the interview. Right. Or, in some magical traditions, it's about enlisting the gods in order to enact your will upon the world.
Yes, exactly. And there's nothing about that in theurgy. It's not about enacting your will. It's
Mm.
really becoming receptive to the divine will,
Hmm.
and that's kind of tricky. It's hard to understand that in a way.
It's tricky, all right. I mean,
Yeah.
I that's core to Patanjali's yoga actually is the reason why you want to stop the fluctuations of the mind is so that the divine self is revealed.
Right.
Because when the mind's churning, you can't realize that. You don't see it. You cannot be an expression of that.
Yes, exactly. And it's interesting that Patanjali doesn't encourage people to acquire siddhis because they can be distracting. It's
Yeah.
totally understandable because as soon as power comes through, because our habitual state is to be self-absorbed and self-serving, we want to say that's my power when it's not my power. But as soon as it happens, we think it's my power. I think this happens to artists,
Hmm.
musicians, for example. Nothing more exhilarating than being in front of a group of people and singing and having something happen through you. And then when the crowd starts to think that it's all you, you can even start to think, yeah, it's all me. But the wise
Yeah.
person somehow realizes, no, I'm just a channel for this stuff.
Hmm.
But it's not always easy to do.
Right. Yeah, it's like the person identifies with the genius rather than seeing as the genius is working through them.
Yes, exactly. That's a nice way to put it. They
Well,
think,
and a little kind of classical schooling could help people to not fall into that trap, right? Because genius comes from the Greek idea of the daimon, which was
that's right.
seen as a tutelary being or a kind of semi-divine
Yes,
demigod that was there to kind of help you, follow your destiny.
right, exactly. And your daimon is not you, but in a way, it's a deeper you.
Hmm.
And that's a colleague of mine, Charles Stang, wrote a book called Our Divine Double, which
Hmm.
is all about how human beings have tried to engage this divine twin or daimon or divine spirit
Yeah,
that's
I'm
connected to
speaking to
us.
Charles next week, actually.
Oh, Charles Stang?
Yeah,
Yeah,
and we're going to talk about the daimon, so that's cool.
it's fantastic. That divine double is it's a brilliant and very very well researched piece of work.
Hmm.
Yeah, you should have a good conversation with Charles Stang. Yeah,
Yeah,
he's
cool.
good.
Um, okay, so yeah, that's the distinction between theurgy and sorcery. Great explanation. There's also something there. I mean, as you're talking about this, the similarities between theurgy and tantra, I also see a lot of similarity with shamanism. And
Hmm.
I've written about the connections I see between yoga and particularly South American shamanism,
Hmm.
the use of chanting, chanting these phonemes or these untranslatable sounds,
Right.
uh, the use of sound to affect a transformation in the person's energetic body and all this kind of thing.
Yeah.
And there's also, the idea that you can use your ritual, your magical powers for healing and kind of creative, helpful knowledge, or you can use them for to enact your will upon others, to make money, to harm your foes, and that kind of thing. So the idea
Hmm.
of the brujo or the sorcerer or
Sorcerer,
the
right.
black magician, yeah, is there as well.
You know, in the last part of this book, I'd never been a real follower of Aleister Crowley, but many people are, and I'm sure you're familiar with him. But
Yeah.
I delved into looking at what he did in working with the subtle body and trying to wake up the body of light, which is what he did a practice of. Carl Jung did that too, but in a different kind of way. But at one point, Aleister Crowley said somebody who achieves this kind of power can transform another human being through their will being directed. They can also kill somebody, he said.
Mm.
Well, okay, that doesn't sound too theurgic. I mean, that's kind of like moving into what you were calling the dark side. But of course, there is that capacity or potential for people to misdirect this. Um, it's a wholly different type of practice, though, than what
Hmm.
Iamblichus was up to.
Hmm. And so, like when Iamblichus, or I don't know, like he probably didn't use the word enlightenment, but what was the goal of it? Like when we say enlightenment, what was he talking about? Because there's
Well,
whole different ideas about what enlightenment is, right?
it's not far from, we use the word enlightenment, but Iamblichus used photagogia, which means leading in the light, was literally a practice of drawing in divine light because they imagined that the divinity was light. So if we draw in the light and it takes possession of our imagination and our subtle body, that's what he would consider enlightenment, being truly filled with light. Um, and the specific phrase he had for it was photagogia, the induction of light. Um, I met a very interesting a woman at a conference recently, uh, Junko Teresa Ukuria, who wrote a book on the history of photography. And she sees photography as the capturing of light. And she connects it directly with the Neoplatonic practice of photagogia, which is
Mhm.
pretty fascinating. There's some really interesting people out there doing some really interesting work.
Okay,
So,
so this induction of light, or
yeah,
uh, to what end? To what purpose? Did he have some idea about it being like to relieve personal suffering? Did he have an idea that it would make a better world for all?
the big question. Yeah, what's the point of any of this, right? Um, that
Yeah.
specific practice or
To
any
what
of it
end?
at all?
Hmm.
You know, instead of having a pat answer for you, like as if okay, here's the answer to that question, I'd rather not know the answer and like take it in and ask myself again, um, what what initially led me into this work and led me to Iamblichus, and why did I get um, so turned on by this work? How did it work for me? And I think ultimately we, our culture, and we individually need to feel as if we're connected to a kind of meaning that's bigger than just personal and bigger than just my life, but that somehow speaks to existence itself. That I want to feel connected to the reason for our existence, why we're here. That that question that a child says, "Why am I here, mommy?"
Hmm.
Mommy doesn't know, because there's no rational answer to that question. But I think we all have that yearning to feel connected to a meaningful engagement with reality. And I think this kind of practice, photogogia, is just a technique to open us up to our participation in a deeper way into our role in being co-creators of the world. I
Hmm.
think that for me, um, ultimately, theurgy allows human beings to become co-creators of reality. I think Ficino was sensitive to that, but
Hmm.
certainly Iamblichus was. Um, and
Well,
so I
yeah.
guess that would be my answer to the question. What's the, why do photogogia? Why do any of this?
Uh,
um, to feel that you're hooked up to the meaningful life in the most powerful way possible for you.
yeah.
Yeah,
But because Iamblichus was writing about this and teaching it, I have to assume that at some point he stated the reason why one would practice theurgy. What the outcome might be. Like with Ficino, it
yeah,
was clearly a therapy for him.
yeah.
People were suffering with different ailments, physical, mental, whatever, and he would prescribe certain practices and stones and colors
Right.
and
Yeah.
music to relieve the suffering, right? To generate health.
I think that when Iamblichus is distinguishing between theurgy and magic, he says that what theurgists, the goal of theurgy, I mean, he describes it in different ways, sometimes metaphorically saying we're trying to get to the divine fire, or we're the athletes of the divine fire. But when he gets to the practical, it's like, what is it we're doing? Our focus is not on trivial things or like, winning a horse race or getting more money, or it's on connecting us with the divine mind, the mind that's creating and has created the world that we're in. And that's the focus. That's the purpose of theurgy, is a kind of, and you could say that that's the ultimate healing, is connecting us with the divine mind, which we all have the capacity to connect with. So that he does state it pretty explicitly. It's in the later chapters of his On the Mysteries where he talks about it. Well, he says we're not doing trivial things here. Purpose of theurgy is to seek the good and the divine mind. The nous is the word that they use
Hmm.
for it.
Hmm.
Yeah,
And I guess to be an agent of the divine mind here on earth,
exactly, exactly.
thereby propagating more goodness, more beauty, more truth.
Right, exactly that. Yeah, which is basically imitating what the demiurge itself is described as doing in the Timaeus of Plato, when he
Hmm.
says that the demiurge did not want to hold the kind of the beauty for himself, for itself, but wanted to expand it as much as possible in a kind of a generative kind of energy. And that's what ultimately the theurgist would want to do, is to become an embodied demiurge, to be a demiurge in a human form, mortal as well. I think that's one of the things that I think.
Wait a minute,
I,
that's sounding awfully Christian.
huh?
That's sounding awfully Christian.
Well, Christians have some good things going for them, you know. Uh, I
Well,
think that
except the fact that only one man was allowed to be both human and divine.
that's the problem with Christianity, is that they don't allow that kind of divine experience to be extended beyond Jesus Christ, who lived 2,000 years ago, and also controlled and managed by the institutional church, et cetera, et cetera. They made it into a business, you could say, and excluded everybody else, but allowed people to tap into it and get some of the power. Unfortunate how that worked out.
Hmm.
And I think that
Yeah.
Emerson's Divinity School address was one of the
Mm.
best essays you'll ever want to read about his critique of Christianity and his admiration for Jesus, but him also saying it's in every one of us, just because Emerson was a Platonist. He knew that.
Mm.
Yeah. Just as you're
Mm.
saying, it's not just one person, every human soul.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Yeah, and you have to, well, I don't know. I guess I imagine that Jesus would have wanted that for everyone to realize that they are both human and divine.
Yeah. If he didn't, he should have.
I agree.
I
I'd like
mean,
to think, if he was a really special guy, like a realized being, that that's really what he wanted, because that's what they all want, when you get
yeah,
down to it.
exactly. I think that the deeper people go into their own connection with divinity, the more generous their spirit is, because that's what I see as that's my model for divinity.
Well,
I think
yeah,
so.
that's an aspect of the divine, right? Is um, generosity with no end.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
Um,
I think he would have been that way. So we can
yeah.
agree on that.
Well, let's imagine him in that way anyway.
I imagine
I'll
that
get
way
along
too.
better with him if, if that's how I imagine him.
Yeah.
Um, okay, so another topic that I'm like always really interested in is the role of imagination and
Mm.
kind of restoring imagination to its I don't know, its true meaning or its true position in terms of not just being something that we've made up,
Okay.
not this
Yeah.
kind of denigration of imagination, but you do talk about the importance of imagination in the practice of theurgy, which I was just like rooting for. Like, yes, that's it.
Imagination's everything for Iamblichus and Theurgy. That we're connected with the divine through our imagination when it becomes possessed and inspired by the gods, when photagogia happens, when the divine light comes in and our imagination is possessed by these currents of divinity, then we are led into a deeper identity. Uh, and it, it's fantasia, but it's fantasia that's possessed by the divine. It's thea fantasia. It's divine fantasy, not human um, fantasy. And I think Coleridge made a distinction between just the imagination we make up, which is just trivial imagination, and sort of a divine imagination, which Coleridge says it's participating in the creation of the world.
Hmm.
So the Romantic poets understood the power of imagination along the lines that you're thinking about, I think.
Mhm.
And yeah, imagination is incredibly important in this work, and we tend to trivialize it because we're materialists, and because our habit is a materialist habit, we think that imagination is just something I make up.
Right.
But in fact, it's not. It can be more than that.
Mhm.
Um, where do
But
our
it
dreams come from?
but it can also be that, right?
It
And
can also be something I just make up. And it can
yeah.
also be, how would I put it? You can be given visualizations to practice. And then at that point, you're making it up. But if you're doing it in the right way, those visualizations can start to take a life on a life of their own, and
Mhm.
they become autonomous, at which point it's no longer your imagination, it's the imagination taking you.
Yeah.
Um, and I think that's what I think Jung was talking about with active imagination.
Yeah.
It's when the images take on an autonomy. They have a certain kind of identity that is as real as your own.
Yeah. I just found it like really interesting that Iamblichus was making that distinction between the kind of self-generated vision, let's say, or images, and the one that is received, so generated by something outside of oneself. That
Exactly.
they're both valid, but you need to have some discernment around the things that I'm generating and what's being received from somewhere else. And I think like that's a key to understanding how active imagination works in practice. What I've found in the shamanic journey circles that I do is I have to give people a kind of education around imagination and
Mm.
teach them that sometimes you have to use your imagination to kind of get things rolling, but then at
Right.
some point something else will take over and you'll be more of a kind of unconscious participant in the imaginal unfolding.
So that we do some of it on our side, but it serves as a bridge to sort of trigger or release a kind of
Or to open to.
yes,
Yeah.
to a living imagination. Um, at a conference that Charles Stang actually and I were both at not too long ago, we had a participant give us a presentation about possessions that he, as a shamanic priest of a Santeria community, helps to facilitate. And he said that they have to be very careful to discern when somebody is quote unquote possessed by an orisha, a divine spirit, um, how deeply they're possessed by the spirit, what spirit it is. Is it possible that the person's just on an ego trip and is faking it? There's all kinds of levels of discernment that need to take place in these people that do these practices. And I think that kind of discipline and understanding and intelligence is really important, particularly in these fields that are dismissed often as woo woo. You know, one has to be really, really discerning in these quote unquote woo woo experiences. And these people know what they're doing.
Mm.
And somebody at the conference said, "Have you ever been possessed?" And he said, "Yes, I have." You know, and he said it with a kind of humility. But people really have experiences like this. They're real. And what's beautiful is that Iamblichus wrote about this in detail. He says you have to discern what God it is that's coming in and how deeply you're possessed by the God. Is it just this level? Is it deeper, or is it a complete possession? Um, and some people don't understand that Iamblichus was talking about real experiences. Um, I've read some scholars say, oh, he was just talking about rituals in ink. In other words, he was just making it up. It was just, his intellectual exercise of making up this shit. No, these
Mhm.
people were really having these experiences. But until you've witnessed it or maybe done it
Well,
yourself,
well, experience it firsthand, yeah.
yeah,
Because even
then,
witnessing it, you could kind of, you could write that off as someone just acting out.
well, yeah. But, I think that the more witnessing you experience, the more you can tell the authenticity or non-authenticity. And you work with people in shamanic circles, and
Mhm.
they have experiences where they become, I guess, connected with spirits or powers or something that's greater than them. Is that something that happens in your
Yeah.
groups?
Well, in these ones, really, it's people kind of entering into imagination. But I have, I've been in ayahuasca groups where
Okay,
actually mediumship is practiced intentionally,
right,
kind of an offshoot of the Santeria traditions and things like that, Umbanda in
you're
Brazil.
right.
And yeah, discernment was talked about all of the time because there was always the question like, is this me acting out under the influence of this drug, or is this actually a real spirit? And so it's kind of an internal investigation, but also you would have elders who were pretty good at spotting when someone was just kind of making it up or acting out to get attention or to just,
Right.
be filled with that kind of inflation where I'm special and.
And you know what? I think that, my initial kind of feeling about that is to be critical of people like that. But we're all like that. It just happens because
Mhm.
of our habitual need for attention. And
Or to
so
feel powerful.
it might just kick in. And it's not like you're a bad person. It's just a habit that comes through. And if there's an elder there or somebody really perceptive, they can help you let go of it.
Hmm.
And then you can allows you to go to a deeper place where the possession becomes real. And then there's less glamour to it. It's more humble, I would think,
Yeah,
possibly.
yeah,
This Santeria priest, Jose Redondo, he just emanated a sort of humility. Um, there was nothing pretentious in the least about him.
yeah.
Yeah.
Well, in Haitian voodoo, they call it being ridden by the spirit, which I
Yes,
think is
being
a
ridden.
good way to think about it or talk about it.
That's right. That's what they do say. And I think that's how he understands it as well.
Hmm.
I was going to mention that you
Hmm.
said that you have some experience with ayahuasca,
Hmm.
and there's a fellow, I think he's in the Netherlands, wrote a book about ayahuasca, and one of his chapters is Santo Daime. Are you familiar with Santo Daime?
Yeah, I
It's a
was
group.
involved with that group for a while.
Okay, he
Hmm.
says Santo Daime as a theurgic religion.
Yeah, totally.
And he has an
I
entire
get it.
chapter explaining Santo Daime using Iamblichus's explanation of theurgy.
Oh gosh. Do you
And
happen
if
to
I
remember
can
the name
find
of
the
the
title
book or
of that book, I'll send it to you. So
Yeah,
you find
that's
that
right up my
chapter
alley.
interesting.
Hmm.
It was very good. He knew what he was talking about. He was very good.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, oh, definitely. I can see that for sure.
Um,
Um, okay, I'm just going over my list here. Uh, yeah, we've already covered quite a lot that I wanted to talk about. Now, of course, I'm a big fan of James Hillman. He's probably my favorite uh, psychological writer.
mhm.
You bring him up in the book.
Yeah.
Both a critique of Hillman's view of Iamblichus and theurgy, his misunderstanding of it, as you put it, but also as where he was taking kind of Jung's ideas into this, polytheistic, psychological, imaginal
Yeah.
practice. Talk about him a bit. Like, how did he come up in your work?
Uh, I've been reading Hillman for years,
Hmm.
and I think he's one of the geniuses of our age. I just think he's
Yeah.
brilliant and deep, and he doesn't have a dogma. It's not like, oh, now this is Hillman's view, and then
Well,
lock it down.
I would
No,
say like maybe his dogma is no dogma.
yeah. Um, but there's two places where I've written about Hillman, and I'm not sure I did it much in this book, but I might have a little.
There's a few
Um,
mentions, yeah.
his original take on theurgy was that he was influenced by E.R. Dodds.
Hmm.
And E.R. Dodd's dismissal of theurgy as trying to manipulate the gods. And Dodds was wrong. And so, since Hillman followed Dodds in that regard, he was wrong. But because Hillman is such a genius and so instinctively always doing the right thing, he came up with insights that work perfectly well with
Hmm.
Iamblichian theurgy. And I, I used Hillman to help us understand theurgy more. There's an article I wrote about dream work with Hillman. And so I admire Hillman a lot. I think that he how do you- in fact, I really turned to Hillman near the end of the book, um, where he talks about Dionysus as
Hmm.
this kind of embodied manifestation of the divine. Uh, and was it that I think it's a quotation from Jung that I used to start that chapter on the divine powers imprisoned in bodies are nothing other than Dionysus dispersed in matter. That's Carl Jung, which is a very Neoplatonic thing to say. um, because the Neoplatonists were immersed in a kind of Orphic mythological reflection about how to understand who we are, using the myth of Orpheus being torn apart and shredded and dispersed throughout the universe, and that we're all parts of the body of Dionysus, trying to wake up to our own Dionysian divinity. But being torn apart is part of what we are, so that
Mm,
we want to accept being torn apart and being kind of messed up as part of how we recover our wholeness. And so there's a paradox there. In order to
mhm.
recover our wholeness, we have to accept our being torn apart. And that's where
Yeah.
Hillman's good. He's able to work both sides of the divide, I think,
Mm,
really creatively. I find
yeah.
Hillman taught me a lot.
Mm.
He was a very interesting guy. I went to a seminar once that he ran. He did not suffer fools either.
No, he did not. Yeah. And I just want to mention that, like, when we're talking about wholeness, like from Hillman's perspective, it doesn't mean reunifying all the parts into
Mm-mm.
one singular like unit.
Right.
It's maintaining the diversity, or like he would say, the polytheism of the psyche. And the wholeness is, well, I don't know, there's a diversity in the wholeness, something like
It's
that,
it's
right?
it's always a hidden wholeness, I guess I would say, and it's found in the
Right,
activity.
because we don't know where the edges are. We don't know what's being left out.
Right. And our tendency is to want to define what the wholeness is
Yeah.
and then crawl into it and be safe. It's not what it's about. It's about losing that and accepting the activity of losing that, which is the Dionysian myth of being torn apart by the Titans and being dispersed into the world. That's who we are. And that's where Hillman's so good. He
Mm.
says, yeah, we have to accept this partness, this separation, this fragmentation, and by, I think by accepting the activity of being fragmented, that's our wholeness. But it's not a thing of wholeness. It's an activity that allows us to feel whole
Mm.
by accepting our being separated and
And
fragmented.
maybe also accepting the incompleteness of our integration, individuation, wholeness.
Right. Yeah.
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 Not pretend, yeah, not a kind of
And I
not
think
living in a fantasy that we've kind of reached some end point where we know all the dark corners and you know.
and I think that what I like about this and what Hillman is good at is that it's only by realizing that you're incomplete that you have any hope of being complete.
Mm.
It's only by accepting your incompleteness that you start to feel what completeness is. It's
Uh-huh.
hidden in the incompleteness,
Mm.
I think. I mean, but it's never explicit. It's always hidden.
Yeah.
That's my feeling for it. It's hard to
Yeah.
talk about it.
Yeah. But I like to wrestle with it, these paradoxes,
Mm.
because they put me in a place of kind of, what would you say, like ambivalence or ambiguity, like the not knowing place.
Yes.
And I feel like when I'm there, that's probably the right place to be. Like I'm reminded of like what Socrates apparently said, that true wisdom is knowing that you don't know everything, or
Yeah.
something like that.
No, knowing nothing.
Mm.
And my wisdom is nothing. There's nothing to my wisdom. um, he did say that there was one thing he did know, which I kind of find to be telling. He
Oh,
said,
yeah.
the only thing I know is ta erotica, things that have to do with eros or desire. And I think that's who we are at our deepest level, is that deep need for finding our completeness, or if our completeness is our sharing in creating the world. I think ultimately that's what we want.
Mm.
Um,
And isn't that what gets us moving on a path like Tantra or Theurgy, is the desire to be like more enmeshed with the world? Like when I think
yeah,
about Tantra, it's an ambiguous kind of word. because it can mean both like a weaving loom, like the
Yes.
act of weaving itself.
Yes.
Uh, it's later come to mean like a book or a technique. And so the way I kind of hold it in my mind is that Tantra is a technique that allows you to weave yourself back into the world and to participate in the weaving of the world, something like that.
Yeah, I like that too. And it's the weaving that connects you to the world, but also connecting you to where the world is coming from. That, the Platonists would call it the noetic source of things, the divine realities, uh, the divine forms, or the Pythagorean decad, that it pours into the world, and somehow we find a way to weave it into our reality. That's theurgy, that's tantra. Yeah.
Hmm.
Yeah, it's really it's a pleasure to talk to you about this kind of stuff. I feel like so this is the kind of you do this kind of guided visualizations with groups that you work with, or shamanic work, or
Yeah, well, the way I really have come to look at it is it's taking like what Jung called active imagination
hmm
and utilizing shamanic techniques to facilitate that.
yeah.
For me, that was always like a missing piece of this Jungian practice of imagination. It's like, well, you know that there are like all of these techniques that you can use to make that happen and to make sure that there's less you involved in the creation of it, right? So you become more open and receptive. Um,
Yes.
so whether that's drumming or different plants that you can imbibe or breath practices or mantra, whatever you can do to kind of quiet the mind, to empty yourself out, allows for this experience of the active, or I think of it more as like, uh, what would I say, interactive imagination.
Mm-hmm.
Because active
uh,
still feels like, I'm being active, I'm generating this experience. Whereas I think like
okay.
interactive is like I'm doing that co-creation move.
Okay. Whatever it is that helps us not think that I'm in control and doing it myself, but
Mhm.
rather that I'm engaging something, and that's taking me to a different place, and I'm participating. I'm in a way being ridden, you could say, using the Santeria kind of language.
Mhm.
It is a kind of being ridden by these images. I mean,
Yeah, we're being
what
taken for a ride. Yeah, for sure.
yeah, in the Red Book, I mean, my God, what he went through in there was it's a hell of a journey, right?
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Kind of against his will being taken on this wild journey.
Yeah,
Mhm.
yeah. But saying yes to what was against his will. That's the paradox again there.
Yeah, right.
I think Jung was an amazing genius for our time.
I think it was Coleridge, right, who also used the term poetic faith, which
Poetic
was
faith.
like
Mm,
setting aside your disbelief in order to enter into an experience and to act as if, like Jung loved to use that term, like act
yeah,
as if, right? Act
right,
as if it's real,
right.
and something real will actually happen, you know?
Yeah, exactly. And
Mhm.
and even that guy who I always had the most high amount of distaste for, Aleister Crowley, said the same thing.
Mm.
Don't dismiss it as just it's only imagination. Just go with it. Let it happen.
Mhm.
Um, and yeah, you're right. I think your focus on imagination is the key. Is probably right on target.
Mm. Um, I'm curious, you as someone who's okay, well, one of the things I was going to mention earlier is when we talk about these scholars who are kind of misinterpreting some of these old texts, for me, going to someone like Mircea Eliade, who wrote a lot about yoga and shamanism,
hmm
two areas where I have a lot of experience being as a practitioner,
hmm
and then trying to understand my experience going to the scholars. And I quickly realized, well, he doesn't actually get it because he's never practiced yoga and he's never experienced shamanism. And so he has all these ideas about like kind of ascensionist ideas of shamanism. The shaman is always trying to go up the tree of life to the heavenly realm. It's like not in my experience.
Hmm.
So anyway, but you come to your scholarship, I think, through your curiosity as a practitioner,
Hmm.
which I feel an affinity for, and I find more kind of trustworthy in terms of like taking what you write as being maybe closer to getting the feel for what Iamblichus was doing, right? So I'm just curious, like after going on this whole journey and getting really into somebody like Iamblichus, like devoting
Hmm.
so much of your life to his work, um,
Hmm.
how does it show up in your life? Are there like little rituals that you do that are kind of theurgic in their way, or are you like a more kind of overt practitioner of theurgy? Like, how does it manifest in your life?
You know, not in a very satisfying way. I would have to say that I don't feel like, oh, I would have to say that the work that I've done on Iamblichus, I think it's really good. I mean, I feel good about it. I feel like it comes from a place of my own experience and I don't think I distorted what he was doing. And I tried to make it accessible on not just an intellectual level, but on a feeling level. Um, what's the net result for me personally for that? Maybe it's too soon to say. I I I just I've just recently retired from teaching at the college I teach at. So I'm sort of shifting how I look at myself. And I've started to feel just recently an appreciation for existing through mm, my human eyes and ears and body, that just existing is just a kind of miraculous gift. And I'm trying to appreciate that more instead of thinking, oh, I have to achieve this, I have to make
Mm,
that argument, this, I have to go to that conference, I have to, you carry on a sort of a professional identity. That's what a lot of scholars do, me included. And your attention gets so wrapped up in your professional identity that you sometimes forget that you're just existence in a human form and able to hear and have children and go buy food at the grocery store and cook dinner um,
mm,
and I'm just trying to appreciate the simplicity of life more now.
mm,
um, I still love to write essays and to try to critique something that I'm interested in. um, and there's some people that have sort of they don't like what I've done or they're criticizing it for this reason or that reason. And instead of sort of being reactive to that, trying to say, sure, why not have that point of view? I mean, it's just, I think criticism and living in the mind and doing it kind of like a lot of intellectual work is beside the point. What's really important is how we live day to day, and probably the work that you're doing with people in those shamanic circles is far more important than some article, I think. That, I mean, it has value, sure, to have an article out there or a book, but making a real difference in people's lives is much more valuable, I think.
mm, mm,
And it might not be it might just be the way you talk to a person at the store,
mm,
quiet ways. Anyway, I'm trying to appreciate the
mhm.
small things in life more now.
Yeah. I love hearing that from you at your stage of life. It's living with this question, like, what are we really doing here?
Yeah,
Um, often the answer comes back to me. It's like to be a sensual being that is able to appreciate this creation in so many ways, through the smells, through what we see, so through what we feel, what
right,
we taste. And so
right.
maybe I'm just here as like a God's sense organ to enjoy and appreciate this creation.
That's what I was talking about. I'm God's sense organ.
Hmm.
That's a nice feeling to have.
Yeah,
And
it takes a
and
lot of the pressure off, right?
it takes a lot of the pressure off because you don't really have to do anything. You're just there as you're the universe being aware of itself through
Mm.
your body.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, this has been a really lovely talk. I've enjoyed it.
I've enjoyed it too, Brian. Yeah. It's great. I mean, this whole world of people doing podcasts, it's a whole new kind of world. And I think you did a good job of engaging me. I felt like you wanted to get at what was authentic, and I felt like you did.
Hmm.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. And thanks for showing up and not just giving us a lecture. I appreciate when people are willing to engage in a dialogue and, like kind of co-creating this conversation together.
Yeah, showing up and giving a lecture is a way of not showing up.
Right. Yeah.
I can't. And unfortunately,
Why
academics
bother?
are the
Yeah.
worst at that.
Hmm.
Let me tell you everything I know and have memorized.
Yeah. And that
Shoot
you've
me.
heard on every other podcast I've been on.
Yeah, right. Anyway,
Yeah.
thanks, Brian.
Yeah.
And
Thanks a
take
lot.
care. All right. Take care, sir.
Bye-bye.